Conventions and agreements ratified by India after 2001. We have seen the older conventions ratified by India in the previous video. In this video, we will see the conventions signed since the turn of the century. First, we come to the Stockholm Convention. A global agreement called the Stockholm Convention was made to safeguard the environment and human health from persistent organic pollutants, POPs. Rotterdam Convention came into effect on February 24, 2004, followed by Stockholm Convention on May 22, 2001 in Stockholm, Sweden. The Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants was approved. The convention became operative on May 17, 2004. 184 parties make up the convention's parties, that is, 183 states and the European Union. The United States, Israel, Malaysia, and Italy are notable non-ratifying states. The Minamata Convention. A global agreement called the Minamata Convention on Mercury was made to safeguard both human health and the environment against mercury's harmful effects. Later, in 2013, the convention was ratified at the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Mercury's 6th session in Geneva, Switzerland. The Minamata Convention became effective on August 16, 2017. The Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions serve as a foundation for the Minamata Convention. The Minamata Convention is a 21st century response to the disastrous pollution in Minamata, Japan, which resulted in the pandemic known as the Minamata sickness in the 1950s and thereafter. The convention's goal is to safeguard human health and the environment against the anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds, and it lays out a number of measures to do this. It has 137 parties and a total of 128 signatories. Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. India is a signatory to the CBD, which strives to promote fair and equitable distribution of genetic resources and the preservation of biological variety. The CBD Secretariat is housed at the UN Environment Programme in Montreal, Canada. India and CBD. The Biological Diversity Act was passed by India in 2002 to implement the CBD's requirements. During the first session of the State Biodiversity Boards, SBB's conference, which was hosted by the National Biodiversity Authority, India presented its 6th National Report, NR6, to the CBD, NBA. In accordance with the 20 global Aichi biodiversity objectives, the convention process resulted in the development of 12 national biodiversity targets, NBT, which are updated in the NR6. In a nutshell, the report shows that while India has met or surpassed 2 NBTs, it is one pace to accomplish 8 NBTs, and it is working to achieve the other 2 NBTs before the 2020 deadline. We come to the Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. It was founded in 1994, and as of January 1999, it has been based in Bonn, Germany. It is the first internationally enforceable agreement that connects sustainable land management to development and the environment. It is the only conference that was directly influenced by Agenda 21 at the Rio Conference. 2006 was designated as the International Year of Deserts and Desertification to raise awareness of the convention. Next is the Vienna Convention for Protection of the Ozone Layer. A multinational environmental accord was reached during the Vienna Conference in 1985, and it became effective in 1988. The Vienna Treaty, which entered into force in 1988 and was ratified by all nations in 2009, was the first convention of any sort to be signed by all parties. It has been ratified by 197 nations, including the European Union and all UN members, as well as Niue, the Holy See, and the Cook Islands. It serves as a foundation for global initiatives to safeguard the ozone layer. The convention aims to encourage international collaboration by exchanging data on how human activity affects the ozone layer. The related Montreal Protocol outlines these. It does not include legally binding reduction goals for the use of CFCs, the main chemical agents causing global warming. Next is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. It is a multilateral environmental agreement to control greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. The Secretariat is located in Bonn, Germany. It was adopted on 9th May 1992. The first conference was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and it has a total of 197 parties. It is also not legally binding. Sixth is the World Charter of Nature. On October 28, 1982, it was ratified by nation states that are members of the UN. It lays out conservation principles on which all human behavior impacting nature is to be regulated and assessed. The relationship between humans and nature is acknowledged in the Charter. It requests that member nations incorporate the above principles into their domestic law on the relationship between humans and nature is acknowledged in the Charter. It outlines 5 conservation principles that should serve as a guide for any human behavior that has impact on nature, such as building roads, power grids, and water supplies. Proper ecosystem should be safeguarded, and the populations of all living things, wild or domestic, must at least be sufficient for their continued survival. Planetary genetic vitality must not be endangered, nature must be preserved, and the interference with its essential functions is prohibited. These conservation principles must apply to all parts of the planet, both on land and in the water, unique locations, representative samples of all sorts of ecosystems, and the habitats of rare or endangered species must get extra protection. Ecosystems and creatures must be managed to reach and maintain maximum sustainable production together with the terrestrial, marine, and atmospheric resources that are used by humans. However, this management must not jeopardize the survival of other ecosystems or species with whom they cohabit. Nature must be protected against deterioration brought on by hostilities or other armed conflict. 7th is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development 1992, also known as the Earth Summit or the Rio Summit. The third major declaration following the Stockholm Declaration from 1972 and the Nairobi Declaration from 1982 was made in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The Rio Declaration, which was approved at the summit and enshrines universal rights and duties on environmental preservation, recognizes the universal and integral character of Earth by forging worldwide cooperation amongst governments. This summit led to the development of the following documents. The first is the Rio Declaration. The first statement, known as the Rio Declaration, comprised of 27 principles that were meant to direct nations towards long-term sustainable development. Next is Agenda 21, which is a non-binding action plan for sustainable development. And lastly, we have the Forest Principles, which are non-legally binding authoritative statements of principles for a global consensus on the management, conservation, and sustainable development of all types of forests. It is how the Forest Principles is officially referred to. It is a non-binding document and contains a number of recommendations for forestry, conservation, and sustainable development. 8th is the Montreal Protocol. It is a historic agreement that aims to preserve the ozone layer by gradually ending the production of several ozone-depleting substances that cause ozone depletion. The Montreal Protocol is phasing out the use of hydrochlorofluorocarbons, HCFCs, in air conditioning and other cooling systems which are destroying the ozone layer. The agreement to phase out HCFCs was signed in 1987 and became effective on August 26, 1989. In accordance with Article 10 of the agreement, a fund for implementing the protocol was created in 1991. The parties resolved to speed up their timeline to phase out HCFCs in September 2007 after realizing the potential advantages to the planet's climate. Following a gradual reduction strategy until the total phase out of HCFCs by 2030, developing nations started their phase out process in 2013. Additionally, the Montreal Protocol aids in the achievement of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Ninth is the Kigali Agreement. This is a modification to the Montreal Protocol. The 197 signatory nations to the Montreal Protocol signed the amendment agreement during the 28th meeting of parties in 2016. The parties' agreement is enforceable in court. Additionally, there are non-compliance penalties to guarantee its application. It sets various goals for nations based on their socio-economic conditions, technical and scientific prowess, and development stages. Countries endorsed a schedule for the progressive decrease of HFCs by 80 to 85% by the late 2040s and decided to put HFCs on the list of restricted chemicals. 2019 is anticipated to see the beginning of wealthy countries' decrease. HFC consumption level in developing nations will be frozen in 2024 and in 2028 for some countries. The Kigali Agreement promotes the idea of respective capabilities and common but differentiated responsibilities. In accordance with the phase-down timetables to stop and lower the production of HFCs, the agreement divides the signatory parties into three groups. Next, we come to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted on 11th December 1997 and entered into force on 16th February 2005. Currently, there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol aims to set specific objectives for limiting and reducing greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions. Because it acknowledges that developed nations are mostly to blame for the current high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere, it merely binds them and lays a larger weight on them under the premise of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities. First commitment: over the 5-year period from 2008 to 2012, it totaled up to an average 5% decrease in emissions compared to 1990 levels, the first commitment period. The second commitment: the Kyoto Protocol's Doha Commitment was approved for a second commitment period that would run from 2013 to 2020. In the second commitment period, parties agreed to reduce GHG emissions in the 8-year period between 2013 to 2020 by at least 18% below the 1990 levels. The Kyoto Protocol is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from developing countries that are parties to the Kyoto Protocol by limiting their use of fossil fuels. The protocol also provides them with a range of market-based mechanisms to meet their targets, including through international emissions trading and joint implementation. 11th is the Paris Climate Deal. Parties to the UNFCCC signed a historic agreement at COP21 in Paris on December 12, 2015 to battle climate change and to quicken and intensify the actions and investments required for a sustainable low-carbon future. The main objective of the Paris Agreement is to increase the effectiveness of the international efforts to combat the threat posed by climate change by limiting the rise in global temperature this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to further limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Key aspects of the agreement. Long-term temperature goal, Article 2. The Paris Agreement reaffirms the goal of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. Next, global peaking and climate neutrality, Article 4. To achieve this temperature goal, parties aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, as soon as possible, recognizing peaking will take longer for developing countries' parties so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of GHGs in the second half of the century. Mitigating on Article 4. The Paris Agreement establishes binding commitments by all parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain a nationally determined contributing on NDC and to pursue domestic measures to achieve them. Next, voluntary cooperation, market and non-market based approaches, Article 6. The Paris Agreement recognizes the possibility of voluntary cooperation among parties to allow for higher ambition and sets out principles including environmental integrity, transparency, and robust accounting for any cooperation that involves international transferal of mitigating on outcomes. Adaptation, Article 7. The Paris Agreement establishes a global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change in the context of the temperature, the goal of the agreement. Loss and damage, Article 8. The Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Parties are to enhance understanding, action, and support, including through the Warsaw International Mechanism on a cooperative and facilitative basis with respect to loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Next is finance, technology, and capacity building support, Articles 9, 10, and 11. The Paris Agreement reaffirms the obligations of the developed countries to support the efforts of the developing country parties to build clean, climate-resilient futures, while for the first time encouraging voluntary contributions by other parties. The agreement also provides that the financial mechanism of the convention, including the Green Climate Fund (GCF), shall serve the agreement. Climate change, education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information, Article 12, are also enhanced under the agreement. Next is the transparency, Article 13, implementation and compliance, Article 15. The Paris Agreement relies on a robust transparency and accounting system to provide clarity on action and support by parties with flexibility for their differing capabilities of parties. CP Decision 1.21 also sets out a number of measures to enhance action prior to 2020, including strengthening the technical examination on the process, enhancement of provision of urgent finance, technology and support, and measures to strengthen high-level engagement. Next Glasgow Climate Pact COP26. The UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow brought together 120 world leaders. They take important steps, but unfortunately, the collective political will was not enough to overcome some deep contradictions. Cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions are still far from where they need to be to preserve a livable climate and support for the most vulnerable countries affected by the impacts of climate change is still falling short. But COP26 did produce new building blocks to advance the implementation of the Paris Agreement through actions that can get the world on a more sustainable, low-carbon pathway forward. What was agreed? Recognizing the emergency, countries reaffirmed the Paris Agreement goal. They were further expressing alarm and utmost concern that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming to date. Accelerating action. Countries stressed the urgency of action in this critical decade when carbon dioxide emissions must be reduced by 45% to reach net zero around mid-century. Climate Pact calls on all countries to present stronger national action plans next year instead of in 2025. Countries also called on UNFCCC to do an annual NDC synthesis report to gauge the present level of ambition. Moving away from fossil fuels, calling for a phase down of coal power and a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Delivering on climate finance. Developed countries came to Glasgow falling short of their promise to deliver US $100 billion a year for developing countries. Developed countries, in a report, expressed confidence that the target would be met in 2023. Stepping up support for adaptation. The Pact calls for a doubling of finance to support developing countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change and building resilience. Completing the Paris Rulebook. Countries reached an agreement on the remaining issues of the so-called Paris Rulebook, the operational details for the practical implementation of the Paris Agreement. Focusing on loss and damage. Acknowledging that climate change is having increasing impacts on people, especially in the developing world, countries agreed to strengthen a network known as the Santiago Network that connects vulnerable countries with providers of technical assistance, knowledge, and resources to address climate risks. They also launched a new Glasgow dialogue to discuss arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. New deals and announcements. There were many other significant deals and announcements outside of the Glasgow Climate Pact, which can have major positive impacts if they are indeed implemented. These are: first, forests. 37 countries took a landmark step forward by committing to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Second, methane. 103 countries, including 15 major emitters, signed up to the Global Methane Pledge, which aims to limit methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to the 2020 levels. Next is cars. Over 30 countries, 6 major vehicle manufacturers and other actors like cities set out their determination for all new car and van sales to be zero emissions vehicles by 2040 globally and 2035 in leading markets. Next is coal. Leaders from South Africa, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, and the European Union announced a groundbreaking partnership to support South Africa, the world's most carbon-intensive electricity producer, with $8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years to make a just transition away from coal to a low-carbon economy. Private finance. Private financial institutions and central banks announced moves to realign trillions of dollars towards achieving global net zero emissions. Among them is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with over 450 firms across 45 countries that control $130 trillion in assets, requiring its members to set robust science-based near-term targets. Companies' obligation. India has actively participated in ratifying the international treaty and has included environmental protection in its constitution. This establishes a constitutional obligation on businesses and industries to save the environment, and they are strongly required by law to do so. In India, companies are required to abide by the terms of these environmental laws to the degree that they are applicable to their commercial operations. Lastly, we come to ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. These duties have prompted companies to adopt ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, a general term for a group of specific data that investors may use to judge the significant risk that a business is taking based on the externalities it is producing. As more investors and issuers use ESG and climate data as tools to support their investment decision making, ESG investing is expanding dramatically. ESG investing got its start in the 1960s as socially responsible investing, when investors excluded some companies or entire industries from their portfolios because of their role in the South African apartheid regime or the production of tobacco. Many ESG investors are still driven by ethical concerns and values alignment today, but the area has now broadened to consider financial materiality. ESG considerations are receiving more and more attention from investors in addition to more standard financial analysis. When a company adopts ESG principles, its business strategy is centered on the 3 pillars of environment, social responsibility, and good governance. This entails adopting actions to lessen waste production, pollution, and CO2 generation. Additionally, it entails having an inclusive and diverse workforce from entry-level employees on up to the board of directors. ESG may be expensive and time-consuming to implement, but it can also pay off in the long run for those who see it through. With this, we come to the end of the video.